happen. Basically, China has to have a long-term appreciation in real terms of its currency relative to the dollar. That's kind of a normal phase of economic development when the wages of labor and the prices of non-traded goods tend to rise relative to the prices of world-traded goods. The only way that's consistent with low inflation in China is to allow the currency to appreciate over the long run. So it has to be what's called a real appreciation. It has to be something that goes beyond the inflation difference between the countries. So China needs to be accommodating that by allowing for this long-term currency appreciation. The second thing is if the U.S. is pursuing an inflationary policy, and you're worried about QE2 in particular, then the right answer to that is not to tie your monetary policy to that in the U.S. And the only way to avoid that tying is to free up the exchange rate, to have something closer to a floating exchange rate. And then China can pursue its own monetary policy and can really achieve whatever inflation rate it wants, regardless of what the U.S. is doing. You're not so dependent on the choices by the Federal Reserve. To think about the Federal Reserve's monetary policy, you have to know that Ben Bernanke, the chair, did his main research about the U.S. Great Depression of the 1930s. So Ben's nightmare, unquestionably, is that he will be in charge. He'll be the chair of the Federal Reserve at a time when the U.S. goes into an economic depression of a sort that might be comparable to that of the 1930s. So basically, as chair of the Federal Reserve, the head of the U.S. Central Bank, he's done whatever he could to try to avoid a depression kind of outcome. And that to him is always being more expansionary. So first, this explains a very sharp drop in nominal interest rates in the United States to the point where the short-term nominal rate, as everybody knows, is essentially zero at present. So this was an attempt to assist the economic recovery and more specifically to avoid a possible depression scenario.
So what your point is central bank should be focusing on the inflation other than anything else.
If you allow the exchange rate to be free, then of course you have the instruments to focus on domestic inflation. So then you can have a monetary policy where the central bank is trying to maintain something like price stability, which is basically what the U.S. has been doing for some time, actually. But if you're trying to maintain a roughly fixed exchange rate, then you can't do both things at once. And then what's going to happen to domestic inflation in China is really driven partly by what the U.S. is doing in monetary policy and partly by the long-run economic development in China, which is going to produce inflation if you maintain the exchange rate. It's automatically going to produce higher long-run inflation if you continue to do well in terms of real economic growth and real wage growth. So it's not to do a favor to the United States to allow the currency to appreciate. I would never say that China should be doing the U.S. a favor, and I don't think it is a favor for the U.S. But from the perspective of China, I think it makes sense to allow for more currency appreciation. And from the standpoint of the Chinese consumer, if the exchange rate appreciates, it means that you can buy more goods and services internationally for what you're producing, and your standard of living goes up. And I would think going forward in time, particularly a lot of Chinese economic growth is going to have to show up in more consumption. That's been held down. The saving rate is astronomical. I think that going forward, the saving rate should be reduced, and I think we should see more growth in consumption. So these things all tie together because the appreciation of the real exchange rate is one feature that would allow for more consumption growth, in fact.
So what's your opinion on the European economy and the United States economy's recovery? Is it in the process or it still need to have time?
It's a very poor economic recovery. It's very disappointing. It's not clear that the long-term prospects are so great. I think Europe is in worse shape than in the U.S. I think the fundamental crisis is crisis of governments. Government policies have been very poor, particularly marked by lack of fiscal discipline. So you see that prominently in Europe and some countries. Greece was very obvious. Ireland is a little different, but prospectively you have to worry about Portugal and then Spain. Spain is going to be the critical problem in Europe and for the Eurozone because it has a lot of economic difficulties, some of it related to the housing sector. It's much bigger than Greece or Ireland or Portugal, and it's not clear that the center of the euro is going to be able to afford to bail out Spain because it's a much bigger economy. I mentioned before some ideas about where I thought the world financial crisis came from and how it related in particular to housing and mortgage markets in the U.S., but I don't think the next crisis is going to take that form at all. I think the next crisis, which probably has already started, is a crisis of governments. In this respect, I think that this is very threatening, and therefore I think the economic future, particularly of the richest countries in the world, notably Western Europe and the United States, is quite fragile. I think the underlying element here is a lack of serious fiscal discipline on the side of various governments. So some of this problem was a long-term problem. So in the U.S., particularly related to the growth of these entitlement programs, such as pension and health care benefits especially. But some of the problem is more short-term in the sense of originating from the response to the financial crisis. So I'm thinking here about all the added government expenditure programs that we had in the U.S. and in other places that have had large fiscal stimulus packages, or things that look like financial bailouts, which have also been a source of added government expenditures. So, of course, there's been a lot of concern in the Eurozone of this type. A country like Greece, which has a long history of lack of fiscal discipline, was kind of first. And, of course, the deficit levels there, which were misrepresented initially, were something like 14% of the GDP. And they were the first country to have a lot of problems. But Greece is not that large, so it's kind of feasible for the center of the Eurozone to bail them out and to prevent default on the government bonds in Greece. Ireland is a bit different, but not really larger than Greece. Portugal is probably the next problem in the Eurozone, but also a small country. I think the really serious threat is from Spain. Spain has a lot of economic difficulties, particularly relating to the housing market, which was actually more of a problem in Spain than it was in the United States in terms of the levels of residential investment and what had occurred with housing prices. So I think that's really the key matter with regard to the Eurozone, is what happens with Spain. Because I think if Spain gets into a situation where paying off its bonds is threatened, it's kind of too large to be bailed out in the same way that the Eurozone did with the other smaller periphery countries. So that, I think, could be the crisis that really breaks the euro as a union. That's certainly a possible outcome. There's some potential for the collapse of the Eurozone in terms of the currency union. That's certainly become a possibility that people didn't take seriously until now. It's also having serious implications for the core central countries, particularly France and Germany. So Germany has embarked on a more responsible kind of fiscal policy recently, and they've been doing a little better. And then the United States criticizes them because they're not expansionary enough. It's really embarrassing, actually. I mean, obviously the Germans were making a good decision, but the Germans are getting very tired of bailing out the periphery countries that have been doing poorly. So the U.S. has its own difficulties. I mean, they've had these very expansionary government programs, stimulus package, other kinds of programs, very large fiscal deficits. The public debt has jumped in the last few years. It's not so much a problem in terms of the current level. It's more a prospective problem. Is the U.S. going to get its fiscal situation in order?
How can we overcome them?
Well, the U.S. has to particularly curb the growth of government expenditure. It has to cut back dramatically on spending, especially for the main entitlement programs. Pensions and health care are the two biggest components of that. That has to be gotten under control. The recent Deficit Commission report was actually pretty good. I was surprised. That was recognizing the core long-run problem and coming up with some potential solutions. But a lot of it is political. There has to be a political consensus that is something that's important to do. And The U.S. and some other European countries have moved a little bit in that direction.